Today, we are talking about how the United States pulled off one of the greatest strategic plays in modern history. It's the story of how America designed the entire global economic system to its own advantage, a system we are all still living in. It's a story of power, of strategy, and, believe it or not, some very, very clever plumbing. But first, I want you to imagine something. Let's say it's 1944. The world has been torn apart by war. But your country, the United States, is in an incredible position. You've got almost all the gold, you've got all the industrial might, you pretty much hold all the cards. And now you get to write the rulebook for the entire global economy. What do? Well, that's not a thought experiment. That's exactly the choice the US faced. And the system it built, it became the ultimate American jackpot. So, here's our game plan for today. First, we'll see how this new order was forged. Then we'll unpack the incredible benefits the US got from it, this so-called exorbitant privilege. We'll see how the system broke and was then brilliantly rebuilt in the 70s. Then we'll jump to today and how the dollar is used as a weapon. And finally, we'll ask the big question, can this really last forever? Okay, so our story kicks off in a hotel in a little town called Bretton, New Hampshire. It's 1944. The war isn't even over yet, but delegates from 44 allied nations have gathered to figure out what the world is going to look like when the dust settles. Now, right away, two totally different visions for the future emerge. On one side, you have the British, led by the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes. He proposes a totally neutral system with a brand new world currency called the Bancor. But the Americans, they have a very different idea. Their plan puts the US dollar, backed by a promise to be redeemable for gold, at the absolute center of everything. And here's the crucial part. They insisted that in the new global institutions, like the World Bank and the IMF, votes would be weighted by how much money a country put in. In other words, money equals power.
So, which plan do you think won? Well, this number right here tells you everything you need to know. 2/3. At the time, the United States held 2/3 of the entire world's monetary gold. Europe was completely broke and desperately needed American money to rebuild. This wasn't really a negotiation. The US had all the leverage, and when you have that kind of leverage, you get to write the rules. And the rules they wrote were very, very good for America.
And that leads us right into the second part of our story, the absolutely incredible benefits the US reaped from this new, dollar-centric world it had just created. You know, this famous phrase was actually coined in the 1960s by a French finance minister. And let me tell you, he was not handing out a compliment. He was pointing out this unique, almost unfair advantage the United States got by having its money become the world's money. All of a sudden, every other country on Earth needed US dollars to trade with each other, to save for a rainy day, and to manage their own economies. This created a massive, unending global demand for America's currency.
So what does this privilege actually mean in practice? Well, you can think of it as resting on 4 key pillars. First, something called seigniorage. It's basically the profit you make just from printing money that everyone else wants to hold. It's like the whole world is giving you an interest-free loan. Second, cheap borrowing. Because everyone needs dollars, they also need to buy US government bonds, which keeps interest rates in America incredibly low. Third, a huge one for US businesses, they face no exchange rate risk because they can buy and sell everything in their own currency. And finally, the US can run up huge deficits without facing the kind of economic crisis that would crush any other country.
But the benefits weren't just financial, they were deeper. It was about something called structural power. And I love this definition because it puts it perfectly. It's not about being the best at winning arguments, it's about getting to design the room where the arguments happen. You set the agenda, you build the stage, you decide the rules of the game. And here is a perfect, real-world example of that power. Take the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The US holds about 16.5% of the vote. Now, that doesn't sound like a majority, right? But here's the catch. The most important, fundamental decisions require an 85% supermajority to pass. You do the math. With its 16.5%, the US has just enough to block any major change it doesn't like. It's a permanent veto, built right into the system's DNA. Okay, this is where the story gets really interesting, because that original system, it had a fatal flaw. By 1971, the whole thing was starting to break apart. But instead of losing its top spot, the US pulled off an incredible pivot and basically managed to win all over again. So here's what happened. By the late 60s, the US had printed way too many dollars to pay for things like the Vietnam War and huge social programs at home. Pretty soon, there were way more dollars floating around the world than there was gold in Fort Knox to back them up.
So on August 15, 1971, President Nixon went on TV and unilaterally, without asking anyone, ended the dollar's link to gold. He broke the core promise of Bretton Woods. This should have been a complete catastrophe for the dollar, but it wasn't, because the U.S. quickly pulled off a brilliant move, securing a deal to make sure all major oil sales around the world were priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. And just like that, the petrodollar system was born. And that's the bottom line right there. Think about what just happened. The United States got to keep all the amazing perks of having the world's reserve currency, but it got rid of the one main responsibility, the discipline of having to back it with gold. It was honestly one of the most masterful strategic moves in modern economic history. And that move brings us to the modern era, where the dollar's power has evolved into something even more potent. It's not just about economics anymore. The dollar has become a weapon. The scale of the dollar's dominance today is just staggering. It still makes up nearly 60% of all the foreign exchange reserves held by central banks around the world. And it's on one side of almost 90% of all currency trades. It is simply everywhere. This total dominance has given rise to a new kind of power, something academics call weaponized interdependence. And it brings us right back to that idea of plumbing. It's about using the pipes and wires that connect the global economy as a tool to coerce other countries into doing what you want. So how does this actually work? Well, a huge number of international dollar transactions have to pass through a clearing system based in New York. This gives the U.S. Treasury a unique and powerful ability. It can see those transactions, and more importantly, it can block them. So when you hear about the U.S. putting sanctions on a country or an individual, this is the switch they're flipping. They can literally turn off their access to the dollar system. But, no system lasts forever. And this one definitely has its costs and its critics. So for our final section, let's take an honest look at the challenges facing the dollar's reign. First off, the privilege isn't free. Here at home, a consistently strong dollar has actually made it harder for American manufacturing to compete on the world stage. It also allows the U.S. government to be a lot less disciplined with its finances than it otherwise could be. And of course, it creates a lot of resentment abroad. You've got major powers like China and Russia actively trying to find ways to de-dollarize their trade. And frankly, the more the U.S. uses sanctions, the more it pushes other countries to build their own alternative systems. So what are the alternatives? Is there a contender for the throne? Well, the euro is backed by a politically fractured union. The Chinese yuan isn't fully convertible. The government keeps a tight grip on it. Gold? You just can't scale it for a modern multi-trillion-dollar economy. And crypto? It's just way too volatile. The simple truth, for now at least, is that the dollar remains on top, mainly because there's no other viable option. So when you boil it all down, what's the big takeaway? It's that power in the 21st century isn't just about tanks and treaties. It's about that invisible infrastructure. It's about the plumbing. The United States built the financial plumbing for the world back in 1944, and it's been setting the terms and collecting the fees ever since. And that leaves us with the ultimate question. The dollar isn't king because everyone loves it. It's king because, for now, it's the only game in town. The critical question facing all of us in the 21st century is pretty simple. For how long?